Not all hope arrives in the way we expect. Omar Mitchell adjusted his hat over his tired eyes as he watched the dust gather on the horizon. The wagon was late, but that didn't matter as much as the knot that grew in his stomach with each passing minute. The ranch around it stretched across miles of dry land, where the grass struggled to survive under the merciless Arizona sun. 3 years of solitude had shaped this man as the wind shapes the stones of the desert, slowly but with a persistence that leaves deep marks. The decision to write for a marriage agency had been made on an especially quiet night, when the howl of the coyotes seemed to echo the very loneliness she carried in her chest. Omar was not a man of romanticism or grand gestures. It was practical. He needed a wife, someone who would bring life to that house that looked more like a tomb with each passing day. He had sent a letter describing himself honestly, owner of a prosperous ranch, hard-working, without vices that compromised his character. In exchange, he asked only for a decent woman willing to build a new life away from the big cities. The answer came 3 weeks later. Margaret Donnelly, 27, elementary school teacher in Boston. The photo showed a serene-looking woman with eyes that seemed to hold untold stories. The letters they exchanged over the next few months revealed a polite, kind person who talked about books and his dream of visiting the West. Omar had been surprised to find that he was waiting for the mail with an anxiety he hadn't felt in years. Now, as the wagon approached, leaving a trail of golden dust in the afternoon air, Omar felt his heart beating irregularly. He had spent the whole morning tidying up the house, cutting his hair, wearing the cleanest shirt he owned. The mirror on the chest of drawers had reflected a man who was trying to look younger than the 52 years he was carrying, but the furrows around his eyes and the work-scarred hands told a different story. The wagon finally stopped in front of the wooden porch that he had built himself with this moment in mind. The coachman, a thin, sun-tanned man, waved briefly before he began to unload his luggage. Omar took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and walked towards the vehicle, preparing to greet the woman who would be his wife. It was then that she came down. It wasn't Margaret Donnelly. It was an older woman, grey hair tied in a severe bun, a dark dress that betrayed recent mourning. He moved with the dignity of one who knew both joys and sorrows, and when his eyes met Omar's, he saw there a depth that spoke of decades of experience. She watched him for a moment that seemed to last forever, studying his face like someone reading a well-known book. The silence that settled between them was broken only by the dry wind that made the wood of the balcony creak softly. Omar felt the world tilt slightly, as if it were all a strange dream from which he had not yet awakened. The woman in front of him carried a gasped leather suitcase and maintained an upright posture despite the long and tiring journey. The coachman finished unloading his luggage and approached Omar, holding out a sealed envelope. Inside, a letter written in firm handwriting explained the inexplicable. Margaret had died of pneumonia 2 weeks before the trip. Her mother, Eleanor Donnelly, had decided to honor her daughter's commitment by offering to take care of the house and ranch as a housekeeper, if Omar so desired. Omar read the letter twice before looking up at the woman who was waiting for his answer in silence. Eleanor Donnelly was about 55 years old, and had lost not only her daughter, but also her husband the previous year. She was alone in the world, with no close relatives or means of support. The proposal was simple. She would take care of the house, the kitchen, the clothes, in exchange for a home and protection. The wind changed direction, bringing with it the smell of sage and dry earth that Omar knew so well. He folded the letter carefully and put it in his shirt pocket, feeling the weight of the decisions that life sometimes forces upon us. The afternoon was drawing to a close, painting the sky with shades of orange and red that were reflected in the tired face of the woman in front of him. Eleanor Donnelly didn't seem like a woman who asked for favors easily. There was pride in her posture, but also a vulnerability that she couldn't completely hide. Omar recognized in her something familiar, the quiet determination of someone who has learned to survive when the world seems to conspire against us. The coachman cleared his throat discreetly, reminding them that he had to leave before darkness took over the road. Omar looked once more at Eleanor, noticing how her hands held the suitcase handle tightly, as if her entire life was contained in that simple object. There was something about the way she watched him that made him think of his own mother, who had been dead for so many years that he could hardly remember the sound of her voice. The decision, when it came with the simplicity of the right things. Omar nodded once, a barely perceptible movement that Eleanor immediately understood. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, and when she opened them again, there was something resembling gratitude, but mixed with an iron determination that promised that she would earn her place in that home through honest work. The coachman departed, leaving a last cloud of dust in the air, and Omar found himself alone with a stranger who had crossed the entire country to honor a promise he had not even made. Eleanor Donnelly remained where she was, waiting for him to invite her into the house that, from that moment on, would also be his. The first steps towards the house were taken in silence, each one lost in his own thoughts. Omar carried Eleanor's heaviest suitcase, noting how it was made of quality leather, but worn out by time and travel. The woman walked with firm steps beside her, discreetly observing the details of the ranch that would now be her home. The wooden porch creaked softly beneath his feet as Omar opened the front door. The interior of the house revealed a clean space, but clearly inhabited by a man alone. The furniture was functional, with no unnecessary embellishments. A sturdy table occupied the center of the main room, surrounded by simple chairs he had made himself during the long winters. The bare walls held only an antique rifle and a faded photograph of his parents. Eleanor scanned the room without comment, but Omar noticed her professional gaze assessing every corner. She noticed the pile of clothes waiting to be washed, the thin layer of dust on the furniture, the dishes piled up next to the fire. There was no judgment in his eyes, just the silent observation of someone who recognized work to be done. Omar showed her the room he had prepared for Margaret. She had changed the sheets for the first time in months and even placed dried flowers in a vase on the small dresser. Now, seeing Eleanor standing on the doorstep, she felt a strange mixture of embarrassment and relief. The room seemed inadequate for both women. Too intimate for the bride he was expecting, too formal for the governess he had received. Eleanor nodded, approving of the space, and placed her suitcase on the bed. Her hands automatically moved to smooth the quilt, a gesture that spoke of decades of tending to homes and organizing lives. Omar noticed that she was carrying a wedding ring on a chain around her neck, hidden under her dark dress. The small golden band swayed slightly as she leaned over to open the suitcase. The kitchen was the next destination of Eleanor's silent inspection. Omar had tried to keep it clean, but the efforts of a man accustomed to eating alone were evident in the poorly washed pots and the complete absence of spices other than salt and pepper. Eleanor opened some cupboards, checked the supply of flour and beans, examined the water pump with the efficiency of someone who knew the domestic needs well. As the sun began to set, painting the windows with golden light, Eleanor had naturally taken control of the kitchen. Without asking permission, she began to prepare dinner using the ingredients she found. His hands moved with the confidence of someone who had cooked for a family for decades. Omar sat at the table, watching her work in silence. The aroma that began to fill the house was unlike anything Omar had felt in recent years. It wasn't just food being prepared, but the smell of home being cared for by expert hands. Eleanor seasoned the beans with herbs she had brought in her luggage, turned the jerky into a meal that made Omar's stomach growl with anticipation. During dinner, they exchanged only the necessary words. Eleanor asked about the routine of the ranch, the meal times, the practical needs of the house. Omar responded in short sentences, still processing the strange turn of events his life had taken that day. The food was better than anything she had tasted since she had left her parents' home decades ago. After the meal, Eleanor washed the dishes without making a fuss, organized the kitchen with efficient movements that transformed the messy space into a functional and clean area. Omar dried the plates without her asking, and for a few minutes they worked side by side in a silent dance of domesticity that neither of them had experienced in a long time. When darkness engulfed the ranch and the nightly sounds of the desert began to echo outside, Eleanor retired to her room. Omar stood alone in the main room, smoking his pipe and trying to process the day's events. The house looked different, as if Eleanor's presence had already altered something fundamental in its atmosphere. He thought of Margaret, the woman he had imagined as a wife, and felt a strange twinge of something he could not fully name. It wasn't exactly regret, as he had never met Margaret in person. It was more like the feeling of a path not taken, a life that could have been, but never would be. During the night, Omar woke up several times to unfamiliar sounds coming from the kitchen. They were not disturbing noises, but the small noises of someone who could not sleep and found solace in quiet activities. Once he got up and peeped through the crack in the door, seeing Eleanor sitting at the kitchen table, writing by the light of a candle. The hunched posture on the paper told the story of a woman processing her own twist of fate. The next morning, Omar woke up to the smell of strong coffee and fresh bread. Eleanor had gotten up before dawn and already had breakfast ready when he appeared in the kitchen. She wore a simple apron over her dark dress and had tied her hair up more practically. The transformation was subtle but meaningful. She was no longer visiting that house, she was living in it. Omar ate in silence, savoring every bite of the best breakfast he had tasted in years. Eleanor poured herself a small portion and sat across the table, keeping the respectful distance of a maid, but with the dignity of an equal. His eyes, which the night before had seemed charged with uncertainty, now showed the resolute determination of one who had found his place in the world. After breakfast, Omar prepared to go out and tend to the cattle. Before leaving, he turned to Eleanor, who was already organizing the washing of the clothes she had accumulated for weeks. He wanted to say something about how good the food was, about how the house seemed more welcoming to his presence, but the words got lost, somewhere between the thought and the voice. Instead, he only nodded once in her direction, a gesture that carried more meaning than any speech. Eleanor understood and answered with a discreet smile, the first Omar had seen since his arrival. It was a smile that spoke of a silent agreement between two people who had found, in the most unexpected circumstances, exactly what they didn't know they needed. The weeks that followed brought a quiet transformation that Omar didn't expect to feel. The house breathed differently, as if it had woken up from a deep sleep. Eleanor worked with the quiet efficiency of someone who found purpose in every task. Not only did she take care of the house, but she healed it from years of male neglect. Omar discovered small domestic miracles every day. His shirts came back from the clothesline without the creases he had accepted as permanent. The food had flavors that awakened childhood memories that I thought were lost. The smell of fresh bread replaced the odor of loneliness that had pervaded every corner of the house for years. But Eleanor kept secrets of her own. Omar discovered her several times, standing in front of the kitchen window, staring at the horizon with an expression he couldn't decipher. Sometimes she held a letter that she constantly reread, folding and unfolding the paper until the marks became permanent. Other times I found her sitting on the porch after dinner, sewing in the starlight with mechanical movements that seemed to soothe some inner pain. One afternoon, while repairing the corral fence, Omar saw Eleanor walking towards the small cemetery that had existed on the property since the times of the previous owner. She carried wildflowers she had gathered in the morning and a small Bible bound in dark leather. Omar watched from afar as she knelt before the only tombstone on the site, a simple marker that resembled a man who had died of a fever years before Omar bought the land. Eleanor remained there for nearly an hour, sometimes reading in a low voice, sometimes just kneeling in silence. When she finally got up, Omar saw that she was wiping her eyes with the sleeve of her dress. At that moment, she understood that she was not just visiting a random grave, but creating a sacred space where she could process her own losses. That night, during dinner, Omar broke the usual silence between them. He asked about Margaret, about what it had been like to raise her alone after her husband's death. Eleanor paused with her fork in the air, startled by the question. As he began to speak, his voice carried the weight of years of longing and pride mixed together. Margaret had been a teacher, Eleanor said, a kind woman who dreamed of seeing the world beyond the streets of Boston. He had grown up reading stories about the West, imagining a life of adventure under endless skies. The correspondence with Omar had represented the realization of these dreams, a chance to build something new away from the limitations of the big city. Eleanor also spoke of her husband, an honest merchant who had died during a cholera epidemic that ravaged Boston the previous winter. The family had lost everything, first the patriarch, then the daughter. Eleanor had been left alone with debts and no means of support, facing the prospect of ending her days in a charity house. The decision to honor Margaret's commitment had been both practical and sentimental. Eleanor had nowhere to go, but she also felt that she owed something to her daughter's memory. Margaret had talked so much about Omar and life on the ranch that Eleanor felt as if she knew the place before she even arrived. Omar listened in silence, realizing that Eleanor had sacrificed much more than he had imagined. She was not just a woman seeking shelter, but a mother trying to honor the dreams of a lost daughter. There was nobility in that decision that he deeply respected. As the days passed, Omar began to notice small details about Eleanor that spoke of a life rich in experiences. His hands knew not only how to cook and sew, but also how to take care of wounds. When one of the horses was injured in a fence, Eleanor appeared with medicinal herbs and treated the animal with the competence of one who had cared for many injured creatures. She could read the weather better than many countrymen, predicting storms by the way the birds flew or the smell the wind brought from the horizon. He knew stories of plants growing in the desert. He knew which roots could be eaten in hard times and which flowers indicated the presence of groundwater. Omar discovered that Eleanor wrote letters every night. When she finally asked whom, she explained that she had correspondence with other women who had lost their families. She had become something of an informal counselor, offering words of comfort and practical advice to widows facing similar difficulties to hers. One morning, Omar awoke to find Eleanor in the kitchen, preparing preserves with fruits he had found growing wild near the stream. She worked with the concentration of someone who knew the importance of taking advantage of every gift of the land. As he watched his deft hands peel and cut, Omar felt a strange sense of completeness that he hadn't experienced in years. It was then that he noticed something that disturbed him. It was no longer loneliness that bothered him, but the possibility of losing it. Eleanor had arrived as a temporary solution to a practical problem, but it was becoming something much more complex and important. The house was no longer just theirs, it had become theirs, quietly but unmistakably. The revelation hit him during an especially hot afternoon, when Eleanor appeared in the corral, bringing fresh water and a damp cloth for him to wipe his face. It wasn't just the kind gesture, but the naturalness with which she took care of him, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. Omar realized that he had begun to depend not only on his work, but on his presence. This discovery brought an uneasiness that he didn't know how to process. Eleanor had arrived to honor another woman's commitment, but she was creating her own bonds with that land and with him. The situation was delicate, full of unspoken meanings and expectations that neither of them had verbalized. The next night, Omar found Eleanor sitting on the porch, staring at the stars, as had become her habit. For the first time since his arrival, he sat next to her on the wooden bench he had built years earlier, with lonely nights in mind. The silence between them was no longer uncomfortable, but charged with an intimacy that grew every day. Eleanor broke her silence by commenting on the constellations, pointing out stars that her husband had taught her to recognize during the early years of their marriage. His voice carried nostalgia, but not the bitterness that Omar expected. It was the quiet longing of someone who learned to carry his memories as treasures instead of burdens. Omar found himself talking about his own loneliness, about the years when the only company was the animals and the desert wind. He told of the nights when he talked to the stars, only to hear the sound of a human voice, even if it was his own. Eleanor listened non-judgmentally, nodding from time to time, as if acknowledging similar experiences. When they finally got up to get inside, there was a moment when their hands accidentally touched the doorknob. Neither of them walked away immediately. For a few seconds, they stood there, aware of the warmth and texture of the other's skin. It was a moment full of untapped possibilities and unfulfilled promises. Eleanor was the first to walk away, entering the house with the serene dignity she had maintained in all situations. Omar stayed a few more minutes on the porch, trying to process what he had felt in that brief but meaningful touch. The desert night had never seemed so full of secrets and promises. The storm arrived on a Thursday in October, bringing with it winds that made the entire house creak like a ship in a rough sea. Omar had felt his approach since morning, when the air became heavy and the animals began to show restlessness. Eleanor also noticed the signs, preparing extra candles and closing all the windows with the efficiency of someone who had already faced many storms of life. When the rain finally came, it came with the force of years of accumulated drought. The desert, accustomed to the inclement sun, received the water with an almost audible gratitude. Omar and Eleanor stayed in the main room, listening to the drumming on the wooden tile and watching the lightning illuminate the interior of the house with dramatic flashes. It was during one of these bursts of light that Eleanor finally spoke about what had really brought her there. It wasn't just about honoring Margaret's memory or finding a safe home. It was the need to find out if she was still able to build something new at 55. If there was still enough life inside her to start over completely. Omar listened as she told of the nights in Boston when she would lie awake, imagining the life Margaret would have on the ranch. Eleanor had spent so many hours thinking about that place that it had become real in her imagination long before her arrival. When Margaret died, she felt that she had lost not only her daughter, but also the future she had helped her dream. The decision to come to Arizona hadn't just been practical, Eleanor continued. It had been an act of faith in a life that could still be lived. Each day at the ranch had confirmed that she had made the right choice, not just for safety, but because she had found something she didn't expect: peace. Omar then understood that Eleanor had not arrived as a substitute for anyone. She had arrived as herself, a complete woman with her own needs and dreams. The silent agreement they had established during the months of living together was not based on convenience, but on mutual respect, and something deeper that neither of them had dared to name. As the storm intensified, an especially strong gust ripped off one of Eleanor's bedroom windows. Omar rushed to help her hold the curtains that flew wildly, and together they managed to close the opening, with planks he kept for emergencies. They worked side by side, soaked by the pouring rain, laughing for the first time since they met. It was in that moment of domestic chaos that something changed between them. Wet and tired, they stopped laughing and really looked at each other for the first time. Not as a rancher and governess, not as a lonely man and a desperate widow, but as two people who had found something valuable in each other. Omar reached out to wipe a drop of rain from Eleanor's face, and she didn't move away. They remained like this for a moment that seemed suspended in time, aware that they were on the threshold of something that would change everything between them. The storm continued to roar outside, but inside the room there was a strange calm, as if the whole world had stopped to witness that moment. Eleanor was the first to speak, her voice low but firm. He said that he had learned not to waste second chances, that life was too brief to pretend that he did not feel what he really felt. Omar replied that he had spent too many years alone not to recognize the gift of having someone who genuinely cared about his well-being. There were no dramatic statements or grandiose promises. Instead, there was the honest simplicity of two mature people who recognized something valuable when they found it. Eleanor took off the ring she wore around her neck and carefully stored it in a small box she had brought from Boston. He was not rejecting his past, but making room for a different future. Omar took her hand and held it gently, feeling the texture of the palms marked by honest work. He said he wanted her to stay not as an employee or guest, but as a partner in everything that life on the ranch meant. Eleanor smiled and replied that she had already made this decision weeks ago. She just hoped that he would come to the same conclusion. By the next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the air clear and the desert transformed. Small green shoots began to appear on the earth that seemed dead the day before. Omar and Eleanor worked together preparing breakfast, but now their movements had a different synchrony, as if they had been dance partners rehearsing for years. During the weeks that followed, they made plans. Not grandiose plans, but small adjustments that would transform a practical coexistence into a shared life. Omar expanded the garden to include the medicinal herbs Eleanor cultivated. She rearranged the house so that it was truly theirs, not just hers, with her living there. In late November, as the itinerant pastor passed the ranch on his monthly route, Omar and Eleanor exchanged simple vows on the porch he had built years earlier with another future in mind. There were no guests other than the horses and the endless sky of Arizona, but there was something more precious, the certainty that they had found, in the most unlikely circumstances, exactly what they needed. Eleanor had never stopped writing her letters to the lonely women of Boston, but now her words carried a different wisdom. He told about second chances that come in disguise, about how mature love is different from young passion, quieter but also deeper. Her correspondents began to call her a source of hope for those who thought they had lost the opportunity to be happy. Omar found that sharing a life with someone didn't diminish her independence, but enriched it. Eleanor had brought to the ranch not only domestic care, but a perspective that broadened her world. She saw possibilities where he saw only routine, found beauty in details that he had stopped noticing long ago. On the first anniversary of Eleanor's unexpected arrival, they planted a rose bush on the spot where she had stepped off the wagon. It was not a monument to the past, but a celebration of the present they had built together. The rose bush would grow slowly, as the love between them had grown, but its roots would go deep into the red earth of Arizona until they became a permanent part of that landscape. Omar looked at the woman who had arrived as a mistake of fate and had become the surest choice of his life. Eleanor smiled back, her hands dirty with dirt, but her eyes shining with the satisfaction of those who planted seeds that would bloom for many years. The desert around them stretched out infinite and unchanging, but the life they had built together was proof that even in the most arid lands, when the right conditions are found, something unexpectedly beautiful and lasting can flourish. The story that had begun with a disappointment had turned into the sweetest of surprises, reminding them that the best destinations are often the ones we never plan to find. Did you like this story of the Wild West? We have many more exciting narratives waiting for you. Subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any adventure.